In 1865, Russian forces under General Mikhail Chernihiv captured the city of Tashkent, one of the great urban centers of Central Asia. In 1868, the Emirate of Bokhara became a Russian protectorate. In 1873, Russian troops entered Khiva, ending another centuries-old Central Asian polity. By 1876, the Khanate of Kokand had been formally abolished and absorbed into the Russian Empire's newly created Turkestan governor-generalship. At almost exactly the same historical moment, something else was happening in the libraries, universities, and publishing houses of Europe and America. The term Tartaria, or Tartary, which for 2 centuries had dominated European maps of Central Asia, was disappearing from geographical discourse. The 1878 edition of Encyclopedia Britannica noted that the name Tartary is now little used, and is indeed almost obsolete. By 1900, both processes were essentially complete. The independent polities of Central Asia had been conquered or subordinated, and Tartaria had vanished from contemporary maps and reference works. This documentary examines the relationship between these 2 simultaneous transformations. Our title poses an implicit historical question: was there a connection between what we might call the end of Tartaria as a geographical designation and the birth of modern history as a discipline and worldview? Did the process that removed Tartaria from maps also establish new frameworks for understanding and recording history itself? To answer this question, we must first establish what modern history means and when historians date its emergence as a distinct intellectual and institutional formation. The professionalization of history as an academic discipline occurred primarily in the 19th century, particularly in German universities. The establishment of history seminars at the University of Berlin under Leopold von Ranke in the 1830s marked a turning point. Ranke's methodology emphasized archival research, critical evaluation of primary sources, and the pursuit of objective historical truth based on documentary evidence rather than philosophical speculation or literary narrative. This new approach to history spread rapidly through European and American universities. By the 1870s and 1880s, history had become an established academic discipline with professional journals, university departments, standardized training methods, and agreed-upon criteria for evaluating historical claims. The same period saw the founding of national historical archives, the systematic cataloging of state papers, the establishment of historical societies, and the publication of massive documentary collections designed to make the raw materials of history accessible to scholars. In other words, what we now call modern history, professionalized, source-based, institutionally supported historical scholarship, emerged and consolidated during precisely the same decades when Tartaria was disappearing from maps and Central Asia was being conquered and incorporated into European imperial systems. The coincidence of timing demands investigation. Was it merely coincidence, or were these processes connected in some meaningful way? Our investigation must begin by examining what Tartaria represented in pre-modern European geographical and historical consciousness, and how that representation changed during the transition to modern historical practice. In European maps and texts from 1600 to 1800, Tartaria, or Tartary, designated a vast but vaguely defined region of Inner Asia. The term derived from Tatar, the European name for various Turkic and Mongol peoples, particularly those associated with the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. European writers had long associated Tartary with the Mongol Empire and its successor states, though by the 18th century the connection was more historical than contemporary. Crucially, in the pre-modern European historical imagination, Tartaria occupied an ambiguous position. It was not quite outside history. After all, the Mongol conquests of the 13th century had dramatically impacted European and Asian history. But it was understood as operating according to different historical principles than the civilized, sedentary societies of Europe, China, India, and the Islamic world. This ambiguity is visible in European historical writing from the period. Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published between 1776 and 1789, discusses the Tartars extensively but treats them as forces that erupt into history from outside, disrupting the historical development of civilized societies before receding again into their ahistorical steppe homeland. Similar patterns appear in Voltaire's historical works and in the universal histories popular in the 18th century. Tartary represented a kind of historical outside, a region that could influence history through conquest and invasion, but was not itself fully historical in the sense that Europe, China, or the Islamic caliphates were historical. This conceptual framework began to change dramatically in the early 19th century, precisely as modern historical methodology was developing. The reasons for this change were multiple and interconnected. Russian expansion into Central Asia brought the region increasingly under the control of a European power whose archives and administrative records were accessible to European scholars. European travelers and explorers, including British officers surveying from India, Russian military expeditions, and scientific explorers, generated unprecedented volumes of detailed information about Central Asian geography, peoples, and history. Simultaneously, the new historical methodology pioneered by Ranke and his contemporaries demanded that historical claims be grounded in documentary evidence. This created a problem for the historical understanding of Central Asia. The region had extensive historical records in Persian, Arabic, Turkic, and Chinese, but relatively few European scholars had access to these sources or the linguistic skills to read them. As a result, the incorporation of Central Asian history into the emerging framework of modern history occurred through a specific channel: Russian scholarship and Russian archives. Russian historians and Orientalists in the mid to late 19th century undertook systematic study of Central Asian history based on newly accessible Persian and Turkic chronicles, Chinese sources, and the administrative records generated by Russian conquest. This scholarship established new narratives of Central Asian history organized around specific dynasties, khanates, and peoples rather than the vague concept of Tartaria. Vasily Bartold, often considered the father of Russian Central Asian studies, exemplifies this transformation. His work in the late 19th and early 20th centuries reconstructed the political history of Central Asia through careful analysis of Persian chronicles and archaeological evidence, presenting a narrative of successive empires and khanates, Samanids, Karakhanids, Seljuks, Khwarezmians, Timurids, Uzbek khanates, that had no place for Tartaria as a historical entity. Western European historians largely adopted this Russian framework. When they wrote about Central Asian history, which they did with increasing frequency as the Great Game, rivalry between Britain and Russia focused attention on the region, they used the specific names and periodizations established by Russian scholarship. This transition had profound implications. Tartaria, as a conceptual category, represented a pre-modern way of organizing knowledge about Inner Asia, vague, generalized, and fundamentally external to the region itself. The new historical narratives produced by Bartold and others represented modern historical practice, specific, source-based, and organized according to the internal political development of the region. In this sense, the end of Tartaria and the birth of modern history were indeed connected. The same methodological and institutional developments that created professional, source-based history also made the vague category of Tartaria untenable. But this explanation, while accurate as far as it goes, does not fully account for the rapidity and completeness with which Tartaria disappeared from European consciousness. Other pre-modern geographical and historical categories, the Orient, the Levant, Christendom, persisted in modified forms even after being superseded by more precise terminology. Why was Tartaria abandoned so thoroughly? To answer this question, we must examine more closely the relationship between geographical knowledge, historical narrative, and imperial power during this period. The 19th century was the great age of European imperial expansion. Between 1800 and 1914, European powers directly controlled or exercised dominant influence over the vast majority of the Earth's land surface. This expansion was accompanied by, and indeed required, unprecedented knowledge-gathering activities, surveying, mapping, ethnographic study, linguistic documentation, archaeological investigation, and historical research. These knowledge-gathering activities were never purely scientific or objective. They served the practical needs of colonial administration and military strategy. But they also served a deeper ideological function. They established European intellectual authority over the colonized world. This dynamic is clearly visible in the transition from Tartaria to modern Central Asian historiography. Tartaria was a name Europeans had invented to describe a region they did not control and did not fully understand. As Russia conquered Central Asia and established administrative control, Russian scholars simultaneously established intellectual control by producing authoritative historical narratives based on previously inaccessible sources. Western European acceptance of Russian historical frameworks for Central Asia, despite ongoing political and military rivalry with Russia, suggests the operation of a shared imperial epistemology that transcended particular national interests. What mattered was that a European power had produced scientific history of the region, replacing pre-modern vagueness with modern precision. From this perspective, the end of Tartaria represents not just the obsolescence of an inaccurate geographical term, but the subjugation of Central Asia to European intellectual frameworks. The region ceased to be Tartaria, an exotic, semi-mythical space beyond the boundaries of European knowledge, and became instead a collection of precisely mapped, historically documented territories under Russian administration. This interpretation gains support from examining what happened to other regions during the same period. Similar processes of geographical renaming and historical reconstruction accompanied European colonial expansion throughout Asia and Africa. Vague pre-colonial designations were replaced with precise administrative boundaries and scientific, historical narratives that invariably emphasized the incapacity of indigenous peoples for effective self-governance, thus justifying colonial rule. But we must be cautious about overstating this connection. While the correlation between imperial conquest and the transformation of geographical and historical knowledge is clear, correlation does not necessarily indicate causation or coordination. An alternative explanation focuses on the autonomous development of academic disciplines. The professionalization of geography and history in the 19th century followed its own intellectual logic, driven by scholars' pursuit of more accurate knowledge rather than by direct service to imperial interests. That this pursuit coincided with imperial expansion may reflect shared aspects of 19th century European culture, an emphasis on precision, classification, empirical observation, and systematic organization, rather than a deliberate coordination between scholars and imperial authorities. From this perspective, Tartaria disappeared not because scholars were serving imperial interests, but because it was genuinely inaccurate and imprecise. As geographical knowledge improved through exploration and surveying, and as historical knowledge improved through access to new sources and better analytical methods, the vague category naturally gave way to more specific and accurate designations. The birth of modern history was, in this view, a genuine intellectual achievement that produced better, more reliable historical knowledge than had existed before. That it occurred simultaneously with European imperial expansion is coincidental, or at most reflects the fact that European global dominance provided Europeans with access to sources and territories that enabled better scholarship. These competing explanations, modern history as an instrument of empire versus modern history as genuine intellectual progress, need not be mutually exclusive. Both contain elements of truth, and the historical reality likely involves complex interactions between intellectual developments and imperial politics. What is clear is that the period from roughly 1850 to 1900 saw a fundamental transformation in how Europeans understood and wrote about Central Asian history. Before this transformation, Central Asia appeared in European consciousness as Tartaria, exotic, dangerous, historically significant primarily as a source of destructive invasions. After the transformation, Central Asia was understood as a region with a complex internal history of successive states and dynasties, now incorporated into the Russian Empire and studied by professional historians using modern scholarly methods. This transformation was essentially complete by 1900. The last major geographical works to use Tartaria as a primary designation were published in the 1870s and 1880s. By 1900, university history curricula, scholarly journals, and reference works all employed the new framework of specific khanates, emirates, and peoples rather than the umbrella term Tartaria. The consolidation of this new framework coincided with another significant development, the emergence of world history as a distinct field of historical study. Prior to the late 19th century, most historical writing focused on particular nations, dynasties, or civilizations. Universal histories existed but were typically organized as chronological surveys of different regions rather than integrated narratives of global development. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the first attempts to write truly integrated world histories that treated the entire globe as a single historical field. H. G. Wells's The Outline of History, published in 1920, represents an early example of this new genre. These world histories required frameworks for organizing and periodizing global historical development. The frameworks they employed were predominantly Eurocentric, treating European history as the main narrative thread and incorporating other regions as they came into contact with or influence from Europe. Within these frameworks, Tartaria had no place. A world history organized around the progressive development of civilization, industry, and rational governance could not accommodate a vague, pre-modern designation for a poorly understood region. Instead, Central Asia had to be incorporated into world history through specific historical narratives: the Mongol Empire, the Timurid Renaissance, the Silk Road trade networks, that connected it to the larger story of global development. This points to another dimension of what the birth of modern history meant: not just the professionalization of historical scholarship, but the creation of new master narratives that organized all of human history into coherent, progressive sequences. These master narratives had explicit and implicit hierarchies. Regions that had developed civilization, complex political institutions, written records, monumental architecture, occupied higher positions in the historical hierarchy than regions characterized by nomadic pastoralism and oral traditions. In this framework, Central Asia's historical significance came primarily from its early sedentary civilizations, Samarkand, Bokhara, and from the empires that temporarily united it with sedentary regions, the Mongol Empire, Timur's Empire. The nomadic cultures that had been vaguely designated as Tartaria were relegated to the margins of historical significance. This hierarchical organization of world history reflected and reinforced contemporary hierarchies of power. European powers ruled over most of the world, and European historians wrote histories that explained this dominance as the outcome of superior European civilization, institutions, and historical development. The end of Tartaria and the birth of modern history were thus connected not only through institutional and methodological developments, but also through the creation of historical narratives that justified and naturalized European global dominance. But we must also consider alternative perspectives on this transformation. Not all scholars accepted the hierarchical, Eurocentric frameworks of mainstream world history. Some historians, particularly those from colonized or dominated regions, produced alternative narratives that challenged European claims to historical superiority. Interestingly, very few of these alternative narratives made any reference to Tartaria or attempted to rehabilitate it as a historical category. This suggests that the obsolescence of Tartaria was not purely a product of European imperial ideology but reflected genuine improvements in historical knowledge that scholars from all backgrounds recognized as superior to earlier frameworks. Central Asian intellectuals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Jadidists and other reformers, wrote extensively about their region's history but did so using the specific names of peoples, dynasties, and states rather than the European term Tartaria. They were reclaiming and reinterpreting their own history, but they were doing so within the frameworks of modern historical scholarship, not by reviving pre-modern European geographical categories. This raises a significant question: if the end of Tartaria was partly a product of European imperial expansion and the imposition of European intellectual frameworks, why did indigenous Central Asian intellectuals also abandon the term and adopt modern historical frameworks? The answer suggests that modern historical methodology, whatever its connections to imperial power, also represented genuine intellectual advances that transcended particular cultural or political contexts. Source-based research, critical evaluation of evidence, and precise geographical and chronological specification produced more accurate and detailed historical knowledge than pre-modern methods had achieved. Central Asian intellectuals adopted these methods not because they were passive victims of European cultural imperialism, but because they recognized the methods as effective tools for understanding their own past. They used modern historical scholarship to challenge Russian colonial narratives and to construct national histories that emphasize Central Asian achievements and autonomy. This points to a paradox at the heart of our investigation. Modern historical methodology was closely connected to European imperial expansion, yet it also provided tools that colonized peoples could use to resist colonial ideologies and construct their own historical narratives. The birth of modern history, then, cannot be reduced to simply an instrument of empire, even though it certainly served imperial interests. It was also a genuinely new way of knowing the past that proved valuable to people across different cultures and political positions. But this does not fully resolve the question of why Tartaria disappeared so completely. If modern historical methods were genuinely superior, we might expect Tartaria to persist as a historical term of art, used when discussing how Europeans of earlier centuries had understood Central Asia, even if not used to describe current reality. Yet even this limited usage largely disappeared. By the mid-20th century, Tartaria had been so thoroughly forgotten that most educated people, including professional historians, had never encountered the term. This degree of forgetting requires explanation beyond the simple obsolescence of an inaccurate term. Why was Tartaria not preserved in historical memory the way other obsolete geographical terms were preserved? Part of the answer may lie in the pedagogical reforms that accompanied the professionalization of history. As history became an established academic discipline, it also became a standardized school subject with approved textbooks, official curricula, and examinations. These educational systems were highly effective at transmitting certain kinds of historical knowledge and equally effective at excluding other kinds. The historical frameworks that emerged from professional scholarship in the late 19th century became the standard frameworks taught in schools throughout Europe and North America. Students learned about the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road, the Russian conquest of Central Asia, but they did not learn about Tartaria, because that term appeared nowhere in the professional historical literature that provided the foundation for educational curricula. Without transmission through formal education, geographical and historical terms rarely survive in cultural memory. The completeness with which Tartaria vanished from cultural consciousness thus reflects the thoroughness with which modern educational systems replaced older forms of geographical and historical knowledge. This standardization of historical education was not politically neutral. The historical narratives taught in schools reflected and reinforced national identities and imperial ideologies. Students in the Russian Empire learned about the historical destiny of Russian expansion into Asia. Students in Britain learned about the civilizing mission of the British Empire. Students in France learned about France's role as a bearer of civilization. These nationalist and imperialist narratives had no place for Tartaria, which had represented a pre-national, pre-imperial way of organizing geographical knowledge. The birth of modern history, in this sense, was also the birth of nationalist and imperialist historiography that organized the past in ways that justified present power relationships. But we should also note that the mid-20th century saw the beginning of challenges to these nationalist and imperialist frameworks. Historians increasingly questioned Eurocentric narratives and sought to write histories that recognized the agency and achievements of non-European peoples. Yet even these revisionist histories did not resurrect Tartaria as a useful historical category. This suggests that the obsolescence of Tartaria was not purely ideological. Even historians who rejected Eurocentrism and imperialism found the term unhelpful because it was genuinely imprecise and Eurocentric in its origins. Writing non-Eurocentric history of Central Asia required using names and categories that reflected Central Asian self-understanding: Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, specific khanates, and tribal confederations, not reviving European labels like Tartaria. We must also consider the role of Soviet historiography in consolidating the disappearance of Tartaria and in shaping modern historical understanding of Central Asia. After the Russian Revolution, Soviet historians undertook massive projects to write Marxist histories of all regions of the Soviet Union, including Central Asia. These histories were explicitly anti-imperialist in their rhetoric, criticizing Tsarist colonial exploitation and celebrating the liberation of oppressed peoples through socialist revolution. Yet Soviet historiography also perpetuated certain Tsarist-era frameworks, particularly the organization of Central Asia into ethnically defined territorial units. The creation of the Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, and Tajik Soviet Socialist republics in the 1920s and 1930s reflected both Soviet nationalities policy and earlier Russian ethnographic classifications. Soviet historical writing about Central Asia emphasized the histories of these specific national groups, treating each as having a distinct historical trajectory leading to its incorporation into the Soviet Union. This framework left no room for Tartaria as a historical concept, which had suggested a broader regional unity rather than distinct national histories. Western historians during the Cold War era, despite their ideological opposition to Soviet communism, largely adopted Soviet frameworks for understanding Central Asian history because Soviet scholars had done the most extensive archival research and had access to sources unavailable to Western researchers. This created a situation where both Soviet and Western historiography of Central Asia were organized according to frameworks established in the late 19th century by Russian imperial scholars, modified by Soviet nationalities policy, but in neither case including any reference to Tartaria. The consolidation of these frameworks in both Soviet and Western historiography meant that by the late 20th century, Tartaria had been absent from serious historical discourse for nearly a century. Multiple generations of historians had been trained in frameworks that had no place for the term. This brings us to a question that has been implicit throughout our investigation. Was anything lost when Tartaria disappeared from historical consciousness? The obvious answer is no. Tartaria was always an inaccurate, Eurocentric term imposed on a region by outsiders who did not understand it well. Its replacement by more accurate, specific knowledge represented clear progress in geographical and historical understanding. But there may be a more subtle loss. Tartaria, for all its imprecision, represented a perception of Central Asia as a vast, interconnected region sharing certain historical patterns and cultural characteristics. The replacement of Tartaria with ethnically and nationally defined units, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, and so on, fragmented this perception. Modern Central Asian history is typically written as a collection of separate national histories rather than as the history of an interconnected region. This fragmentation may obscure important historical patterns and connections that transcended particular ethnic or political boundaries. Some recent scholarship has attempted to write more integrative histories of Central Asia that recognize patterns and connections across the entire region. These works do not resurrect Tartaria as a term, but they do attempt to recover the perception of regional unity that Tartaria had imperfectly captured. This suggests that the relationship between the end of Tartaria and the birth of modern history was more complex than simple progress from ignorance to knowledge. Modern history brought genuine improvements in accuracy and detail, but it also brought new frameworks and categories that, while more precise, potentially obscured certain kinds of understanding that pre-modern frameworks had captured, however imperfectly. We should also consider what was happening simultaneously in other regions. Was the transformation of Central Asian geography and history unique, or was it part of a broader global pattern? The late 19th century saw similar transformations throughout Asia and Africa. European explorers and colonizers produced new maps that replaced indigenous place names with European names, or that imposed precise boundaries on regions that had previously had fluid, contested borders. European and American scholars produced new historical narratives organized according to European periodizations and categories. In Africa, pre-colonial political structures and geographical designations were replaced by colonial administrative units, whose boundaries often bore no relationship to indigenous political or cultural geography. These colonial boundaries later became the borders of independent African nations, perpetuating the geographical frameworks established by colonialism. In Southeast Asia, European scholars discovered and reconstructed the history of classical kingdoms like Angkor and Pagan, incorporating them into narratives of rise and fall that reflected European assumptions about civilization and decline. Across the colonized world, the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the imposition of European intellectual frameworks, geographical, historical, ethnographic, that displaced or subordinated indigenous forms of knowledge. This process was integral to colonial rule, establishing European intellectual authority as a complement to European political and military power. The end of Tartaria and the birth of modern history were, from this perspective, local manifestations of a global process of intellectual colonization that accompanied and enabled political colonization. But this interpretation must be qualified by acknowledging that the process was never entirely one-directional. Indigenous intellectuals did not passively accept European frameworks, but adapted, modified, and challenged them. They used the tools of modern scholarship to reconstruct their own histories in ways that challenged colonial narratives and asserted indigenous agency and achievement. In Central Asia, this process of intellectual decolonization began with the Jadidist movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and continued through the Soviet period and into the post-independence era. Central Asian historians have written increasingly sophisticated histories of their region that, while using modern scholarly methods, reject the Eurocentric and Russocentric biases of earlier historiography. These histories do not revive Tartaria, but they do challenge the historical frameworks that accompanied its disappearance, particularly the notion that Central Asian history is significant primarily in relation to Russian or European history. This raises a final question about the relationship between our title's two components. Was the birth of modern history actually coterminous with the end of Tartaria, or are we looking at two distinct processes that happen to coincide chronologically? The historical evidence suggests genuine connections. The professionalization of history as an academic discipline, the development of source-based historical methodology, and the creation of new historical narratives organized around nations, progress, and civilization all occurred during the same decades when Tartaria disappeared from European consciousness and Central Asia came under Russian imperial control. These connections were not coincidental. Modern historical methodology required access to sources, which colonial conquest often provided. Professional historians were trained in universities that were embedded in imperial societies and served imperial interests. The historical narratives produced by modern historians reflected and justified the power relationships of their time. Yet modern historical methodology also proved to be more than simply an instrument of empire. Its emphasis on evidence, critical analysis, and empirical verification established standards that could be applied by scholars of any nationality or political position. Colonial subjects could use modern historical methods to challenge colonial narratives and reconstruct their own histories. The birth of modern history, then, was both an instrument of European imperial dominance and a set of intellectual tools that transcended particular imperial interests. Its relationship to the end of Tartaria was intimate but complex. Tartaria represented a pre-modern way of knowing a region that Europe did not control and did not understand. Its disappearance marked Central Asia's incorporation into European intellectual frameworks, a process inseparable from its political incorporation into the Russian Empire. But this incorporation was not simply the imposition of false consciousness. It also brought genuine increases in historical knowledge, based on access to previously inaccessible sources and more rigorous analytical methods. The paradox of modern history is that it was simultaneously an instrument of domination and a genuine intellectual achievement, simultaneously Eurocentric and universal, simultaneously complicit with empire and potentially liberatory. We can see this paradox clearly in the history we've been examining. Russian imperial conquest enabled Russian historians to access Persian and Turkic sources, and to reconstruct Central Asian history with unprecedented detail and accuracy. Yet these reconstructions, while more accurate than vague references to Tartaria, also served to justify Russian rule by demonstrating Russian scholarly authority over the region. Western European and American historians adopted Russian frameworks, partly because they recognized the quality of Russian scholarship and partly because doing so served their own imperial interests by establishing European intellectual authority over non-European regions. Central Asian intellectuals later used the tools of modern history to challenge Russian and European narratives, producing histories that emphasized Central Asian agency and achievement. But they did so within the frameworks of modern historical scholarship, not by attempting to revive pre-modern concepts like Tartaria. This suggests that the birth of modern history created frameworks that proved surprisingly durable and adaptable. The basic methods of modern historical scholarship, archival research, critical source evaluation, empirical verification, have remained largely constant even as the political and ideological contexts of historical writing have changed dramatically. The end of Tartaria, by contrast, appears final and irreversible. Despite the recent internet-driven rediscovery of the term, no serious scholar has suggested reviving it as a useful historical or geographical category. The knowledge that replaced it, specific, source-based, empirically grounded, has proven definitively superior for purposes of understanding Central Asian geography and history. What has not been definitively resolved is the question of how to evaluate the broader transformation that the end of Tartaria represents. Was this transformation primarily progress, the replacement of ignorance with knowledge, imprecision with accuracy? Or was it primarily domination, the subordination of Central Asia to European intellectual framework serving imperial interests? The historical evidence suggests it was both. The transformation brought genuine improvements in geographical and historical knowledge. But it also served imperial interests and established intellectual hierarchies that reinforced political hierarchies. Modern history was born in the context of European imperial expansion and reflects that context in its methods, frameworks, and narratives. Yet it also developed intellectual standards and practices that proved valuable beyond the context, capable of being used to challenge as well as to support imperial ideologies. The end of Tartaria and the birth of modern history were intimately connected processes, but their relationship defies simple characterization as either progress or domination. The transformation was both, inextricably intertwined in ways that continue to shape how we understand the past. We began this investigation by noting the chronological coincidence between Tartaria's disappearance from European maps and the consolidation of modern historical practice. We have seen that this coincidence reflected deep connections between geographical knowledge, historical methodology, and imperial power. But we have also seen that these connections were complex and multifaceted, involving genuine intellectual advances alongside the exercise of power, universal aspirations alongside particular interests, liberation alongside domination. The title of our documentary implies a causal relationship, the end of Tartaria and the birth of modern history. The historical evidence supports this relationship, but reveals it to be far more complex than any simple formula could capture. Tartaria ended because European powers conquered and incorporated Central Asia, generating the access and knowledge necessary to replace vague designations with precise ones. Modern history was born partly to make sense of this newly accessible information, establishing frameworks and methods for organizing and interpreting the expanding archive of human experience. But modern history was also born from internal intellectual developments, the pursuit of more rigorous methods, the desire for empirical grounding, the professionalization of academic disciplines. And Tartaria ended partly because it was genuinely inaccurate, a placeholder term that had always acknowledged its own inadequacy. The two processes reinforced each other, but neither can be fully reduced to the other. Together, they transformed how Europeans understood Central Asia and how history itself was conceived and practiced. This transformation occurred over a surprisingly brief period, roughly 50 years from 1850 to 1900. By the end of this period, both Tartaria and pre-modern historical practice had been consigned to obsolescence, replaced by precise geographical knowledge and professional historical methodology. The rapidity of this transformation explains why it was so complete. Unlike longer, more gradual changes that different generations experienced differently, this transformation occurred quickly enough that a single generation witnessed both the old framework and the new, and chose decisively in favor of the new. That generation, the last to learn about Tartaria in their youth and the first to practice modern historical scholarship in their maturity, served as a hinge between two different ways of knowing the world. After them, the old ways were simply forgotten, replaced so thoroughly that later generations would be unaware they had ever existed. This is why the contemporary rediscovery of Tartaria seems so mysterious to many people. They encounter evidence of a geographical designation that once appeared on every map, but has been completely absent from their own education and cultural experience. Without understanding the historical processes we've examined in this documentary, this disappearance can seem suspicious or conspiratorial. But the historical record reveals no conspiracy, only a transformation, profound but comprehensible, in how Europeans understood Central Asian geography and history. This transformation was part of the larger birth of modern history as an intellectual and institutional formation. What remains unresolved is the question of how to evaluate this transformation. The frameworks of modern history have proven durable and productive, enabling detailed understanding of Central Asian history that was impossible under the vague designation of Tartaria. Yet these same frameworks were complicit with imperial conquest and reflected Eurocentric biases that continue to shape historical understanding. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that the end of Tartaria and the birth of modern history represent a transition that was simultaneously progressive and problematic, that brought gains and losses, that expanded knowledge while also serving power. The last word should perhaps belong to those who live in the region once vaguely labeled Tartaria. Central Asian historians and intellectuals have inherited the methods of modern history, but have turned those methods to their own purposes, writing histories that challenge Russian and European narratives while meeting the empirical standards of modern scholarship. They do not mourn the end of Tartaria, a term that never reflected their own understanding of their homeland. But they continue to grapple with the frameworks and categories that modern history established, accepting some, modifying others, and developing new approaches that better capture their historical experience. In doing so, they demonstrate that modern history, while born in a context of imperial expansion, need not remain bound to that context. The methods can be separated from the ideologies that initially shaped them. Knowledge gained through imperial conquest can be turned against imperial narratives. This suggests that the birth of modern history, while intimately connected to the end of Tartaria and to European imperial expansion, ultimately produced tools and practices that transcended their problematic origins. The end of Tartaria marked the end of a pre-modern European way of imagining Central Asia. The birth of modern history marked the beginning of new ways of knowing the past, ways that have proven both powerful and problematic, both liberating and constraining, both universal and particular. Our investigation cannot resolve these contradictions because they are built into the historical processes we've examined. What we can do is make those processes visible, showing how geographical and historical knowledge transformed during a crucial period of European imperial expansion, and how those transformations continue to shape our understanding of the past. The documentary ends where it began, with the observation that Tartaria disappeared from maps at precisely the moment when modern history consolidated as an intellectual and institutional formation. We have seen that this was not coincidence, but reflected deep connections between how we know places and how we understand the past. Understanding these connections does not resolve the question of how to evaluate them. But it does allow us to see the birth of modern history not as a simple triumph of reason over ignorance, but as a complex transformation that brought both gains and losses, progress and domination, knowledge and power, inextricably intertwined.